Okay, welcome to this evening's forum, where we are going to have a question and answer session between representatives of fields of expertise that relate to issues in the current campaign and representatives of two of the four parties that are reflected on the ballot. So what I'd like to do is introduce these people and have each of them say just a little bit about their background, and we'll start with the experts here. And the first one is Christopher Musty, who is the Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Montana.
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here. Welcome to everyone. I'm Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Montana. My name is Christopher Musty. My areas of specialization are the news media, public opinion, and political participation. I have a PhD from the University of California, and I've worked prior to coming to the University of Montana at Louisiana State University. And in the 2004 election, I was the senior polling analyst at the Washington Post.
And our other expert this evening is Douglas Dallenberg, Chair and Professor of the Department of Economics of the University of Montana.
Thanks to the League of Women Voters for inviting us tonight. My name is Douglas Dallenberg. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Montana. My area of expertise is statistical analysis, and I received my PhD from the University of Oregon.
And I want to make just one additional statement here, which is that the League of Women Voters are very pleased to be here, but we need to give acknowledgement to Anita Millard of the library, of the Missoula Public Library, who is the person who has organized all of this. Okay, going on with our introductions, we had hoped to have representatives from all four of the political parties who are represented on the Missoula ballot. It didn't work out that way. The Constitution Party person has not shown up this evening. The representative of the Republican Party, we invited, or the Republicans were invited to send somebody, and they declined to do so, okay? So we have representatives first of the Democratic Party. This is Michelle Reinhardt.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Anita. And thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me. My name is Michelle Reinhardt. I'm a state House representative for House District 97. I was also a delegate for Barack Obama to Denver for the Democratic National Convention. I've been going door to door for my own campaign and also for Barack Obama because I believe in his vision to bring our country together at a very challenging time in our nation's history and in the world. And I believe that Barack Obama will be a unifying leader to make our government work for people again and not for special interests.
Okay, and yes, and our final participant this evening is Mike Fellows, representing the Constitution Party. And
Libertarians.
Libertarians, yes. My apologies.
Yes, thank you, Anita, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm sorry that the Republicans didn't show up. It would have been nice to have debated those guys. We see McCain's farewell tour, but I'm the chair for the Libertarian Party here in Montana. I've lobbied the legislature on various occasions. I'm running for the U.S. House currently, and I was a delegate to our convention in Denver, where we nominated our presidential candidate, Bob Barr, who's polling anywhere from 1% to 6% in the national polls.
So we're delighted to have you all. Now, our format for this evening is going to be questions coming from our experts. They will take turns asking questions, and they will provide backgrounds from their fields of interest for the questions that they are asking. And then after each question, each of the representatives of the political parties will have an opportunity to answer that question. First for Doug.
So my first question deals with the economic downturn that we're experiencing. And I'm going to ask you about the proper approach to this economic downturn. Let me give you a little background. Notice I called it an economic downturn and not a recession. It's not officially a recession until a group of 6 economic historians decide it's a recession. But nevertheless, the unemployment rate is up to 6.1%. That's up from 4.7% a year ago, September. What is confusing to people is output growth has not completely stagnated. In the first quarter, it was about 0.9%, And in the second quarter, it rose to 2.8%, but that's somewhat misleading. And that is giving the committee that decides on whether we're in a recession or not some headaches, because usually as unemployment rises and output growth declines, we know we're in a recession. But this time we've seen some growth and output growth. But that's a little bit misleading, because if you look at the breakdown, what you find is that that growth and output is primarily due to growth in exports. As the U.S. economy weakened, the dollar fell, and we started exporting more. Now that the financial crisis has spilled over to Europe and Asia, what we're seeing is U.S. output growth falling dramatically. Industrial production in September fell by about 2.9%. So the question is, given that we are in an economic downturn and that most economists see things getting worse before they get better, what is the appropriate federal government policy to this economic downturn?
Okay, and Mike, you get first crack at this question.
Well, it seems to me there's plenty of problems to go around. I think one of the main things we have, obviously, is the government spending. We've got a $13 trillion debt if we include all the unfunded liabilities. It moves up to around 53 trillion. There are some that even say it's closer to 100 trillion or above. We've got a huge trade deficit with China. They're buying all our debt. For the most part, the dollar is shrinking. That's causing some problems with the euro and in Europe. For a while there, the dollar was causing oil prices to rise. Now they're going back down again. I always like to say sometimes I attribute that to the simple fact that Congress is not in session right now, so they can't really screw things up to some degree. Another problem, I think, is the Federal Reserve. That's always been kind of a problem. When Federal Greenspan decided to hold interest rates down to about 1%, it made credit awfully easy to borrow, even people that couldn't essentially pay it back or didn't have the resources to continue to pay it back. So I think we do have to deal with the Fed on this issue. They get a 6% guaranteed rate, whether the rates go up or down, whether the economy goes up or down. So that's something that Congress is going to have to deal with this next session. And obviously, we'll have to deal with the spending problems and the deficit trade problems.
Thank you very much for the question. As I go door to door and talk to neighbors in the community, I know that people are hurting. I was speaking with my friend Nick, who works at the food bank, and they cannot keep enough food on their shelves. So many people are having trouble just getting enough food to put on the table, or paying for gas, and wages aren't stretching as far as they used to. And even though Montana hasn't seen the worst of the economic problems, Montana's working families are feeling the squeeze of the economic downturn and the squeeze from stagnant wages and the rising prices for food and gas. If we don't turn this economy around, the crisis on Wall Street will hit Main Street. And we can't have 4 more years of the same failed economic policies of the Bush-McCain philosophy of giving tax breaks to large corporations and the super rich. Barack has a plan to get this economy moving again by investing in the middle class, providing relief to homeowners, and stabilizing our financial system. Importantly, Barack has put forward a rescue plan for Main Street to provide immediate relief to help small towns across Montana. This is a plan that should be implemented immediately. Obama has shown steady leadership during the crisis and has offered concrete solutions to move the country forward. Already in this campaign, he's unveiled plans to give 95% of us, that's the middle class, a tax cut and eliminate income taxes for seniors making under $50,000, and bring down the cost of health care for families and businesses, and create millions of new jobs by investing in renewable energy sources. John McCain has been erratic and unsteady since the crisis began, staggering from position to position, and by his own campaign's admission, trying to change the subject away from the economy by launching false character attacks. We need somebody that understands the pain that Montana families are feeling, not somebody who's out of touch, who can't even remember how many houses they own when people are trying to just stay in the one house that they have.
Okay. Next from...
Thank you very much. Panelists, I have a question that has to do with a campaign that we're currently nearing the end of, only 8 days left to go. And we've been at this campaign, or I should say the candidates have been at the campaign for well over a year now. And this campaign has not just set a record for the length of time, but also for the amount of money spent on both sides. And we've seen for the first time a candidate decline to take public financing in the general election campaign and far outraise his opponent. I'd like to know, what would you do to address the high cost of elections, especially presidential campaigns, recognizing that the Supreme Court has overturned at least a portion of every campaign finance law passed at the national level since 1972. And if you believe so, could you tell us if you think that our fears and concerns about the role of money in political campaigns is overblown? And if so, how would you address those concerns that people have, but that you think may be over-exaggerated?
Okay, Michelle, your turn to go first.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. As a candidate for public office, I understand how expensive campaigns can be and that you have to ask everyone you know for money. That includes all of your family members, teachers, professors, all of your coworkers, and complete strangers for funds. You also ask people who have like-minded views about the world, whether it be for conservation or for public education, for support too, if they would like to see you go back and keep being a champion for those important causes. There is a group, though, that has a large amount of influence, and those are 527 groups and PACs, and those who play in races, playing by independent expenditures, sending out mail pieces or attack ads. And a lot of that money is not really followed. I think if we crack down on some of the independent expenditures, then it would be easier for a president to take public financing. One of the reasons Barack Obama said that he wasn't going to take public financing is because he had to be able to defend himself against the smear tactics that we're seeing now. And the attack ads by these independent groups and by the McCain campaign. So I think that regulations of some of the independent groups would go a long way, and that would make it easier for candidates to take public financing, and that would be enough. The reality is campaigns are very expensive, and it takes a lot of money to pay for organizers to be in every state across the country, and to pay for TV ads is very expensive. In order to change that, that would be a much broader overhaul of the political system.
Okay, Mike?
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, money is it can be a trouble in politics. It can be a good sign too. But if you look at the two major candidates, look at all the money they're spending that could go to healthcare, that could go to communities, that could go to helping the local nonprofit volunteer organizations out in their local community. That's something that's lacking. We always talk about money, and there definitely is a problem. When we talk about all the money that Fannie and Freddie gave, the two largest recipients were Barack Obama and Chris Dodd. And so we know that the money that they gave those two politicians certainly reflected their actions in Congress. I think, too, some of the problems we have with the 587 certainly relates to McCain-Feingold. You know, the Right to Life had a lawsuit here that says they want to be able to have advertisements against candidates the last 30 days of an election. We can't do that. I mean, the NRA endorses John McCain, yet the NRA can't do their own 30-second or 60-second advertisements 30 days before the election. That's a problem. When you look at the campaign finance or matching funds, there's only about 12% of the American public that actually check the box on their tax returns. That's going broke. We look at past history in 95, I believe, when the government shut down. Guess who got their matching funds? It was the presidential candidates. They thought that was very essential. I didn't think that was really an essential part of the government at that time. I think one of the solutions would be to open up the process, especially for federal candidates, as I am one. I mean, if somebody wants to donate $20,000 to my campaign to go out and explain my issues, I think that's the way it should be. I think sometimes we limit campaign money in some ways, but obviously we're going to need some kind of reciprocity, or I should say, where people know who's donating. I think that's, a lot of people would like to see that, so you know that if somebody gives me $20,000, they know who it actually came from. We've seen more money this year in, say, Max Baucus's campaign from out-of-state interests rather than local interests. That could be a problem, too, since he's going to be probably still ahead of the Finance Committee in the Senate. You know, are those donations that are coming from PACs and fiscal unions and corporations, you know, that they're going to influence his decisions when they come to vote. So I think that's going to be some problems. So I think the role of money is a problem. I think there are some things we do have to change, like getting rid of the matching funds and expending the limits for donations.
Okay. Thank you all. Now, back, let's see. I guess we go, there we go.
So this question is more about long-term economic growth, and it goes back to some issues that you have touched on. We have been importing more than we have been exporting for a long time now, and in recent years the federal government has been deficit spending, and in addition the U.S. economy has one of the lowest savings rates in the world. And so all three of those mean that we are borrowing to finance our current consumption. And so the question is, in the long run, since to the extent that we have borrowed money from foreign sources, we're going to have to pay it back. And that is going to require either a lower standard of living for our children or grandchildren, or an increase in taxes. Now, none of the four parties have talked about increasing taxes, so does that mean we're going to have to accept a lower standard of living? So my question then is, do you accept this as an accurate description of a long-term problem that the country faces? And if so, what, if anything, should be done about it? And if not, why isn't it a problem?
Okay, Mike, I think you get to start this one.
Well, thank you for the question, by the way, but this country's been going downhill for quite a long while. We've had record deficit spendings with the Republicans, a majority in Congress. We've had the biggest entitlements in 2003 by the Republicans. Certainly the Democrats haven't helped much either. We're bailing out the auto industries. We've actually given them $25 million. We gave Wall Street $700 billion. We gave Fannie and Freddie $300 billion, but who's going to bail us out when we can't pay our bills? And when you look at spending proposals that all candidates have put out, Barack Obama proposes $300 billion in new spending. Well, if we're not going to raise taxes, that's got to come from somewhere. We're going to have more deficit spending. John McCain proposes $100 billion in new taxes. That's going to come from somewhere. So either we reduce spending or we're going to have to raise taxes. That's the same thing with the couple of our entitlement programs that are going broke, Medicare and Social Security. We haven't got too many options with those things. They're going to go broke in, some say 20 years, some say maybe less than that. But we're either going to have to raise the age of retirement for Social Security, or we're going to have to raise taxes to simply pay for the retirees that are coming up to pay for the baby boom generation. So I think the only typical solution has got to be here is we're going to have to lower taxes, stimulate the economy, lower things like the capital gains tax. We're certainly going to have to lower spending. We're going to have to look at all the unconstitutional programs we have in Washington, D.C. that don't purport to the Constitution and get rid of those things. I mean, everybody talks about the No Child Left Behind Act, which hasn't really done anything. And since President Carter instituted the Department of Education, where has education gone from? We used to be number one in subjects like science and math, and now we're down to 21st or below. That's a problem when Europe's doing a lot better than we are in those subjects. And consequently, the Department of Education really doesn't educate. So I would think that a Barr presidency and what he talked about was getting rid of some of these programs like the Department of Education. We spend over $60-some billion a year on that program, and really, like I say, it doesn't educate. We should leave education to states and localities. In the meantime, we have to get our spending under control, and certainly Barack Obama and John McCain are not willing to do that, as I have seen.
It's a very good question for the long term, because the debt that we have inherited, thank you to George W. Bush, our children and grandchildren will be paying off for a long time to come. We do need to live within our means as American families. We need to save, and we need to do that as a nation. But first, we have to address some of the short-term things. We need to return to the fundamentals of the economy again, starting with investing in America again, in small businesses and new industries that put people to work, in public education, technical schools, and affordable college tuition so American workers can compete in the global economy, and that the American dream would be accessible to everyday Americans and Montanans again. We need to invest in new energy sources that reduce the price of gas and create millions of jobs. Most Americans agree it's time, way past time, to reduce our dependence on oil. We need to return to the fundamentals and stimulate the private sector, but big business should not call all of the shots. With the price of gas and groceries skyrocketing and people turning to their credit cards to make ends meet, we shouldn't let credit card companies raise their rates and hide extra fees in the small print. We need to say no to predatory lending. And returning to the fundamentals means ending wasteful spending in the government and running government well. It means eliminating tax cuts for the super rich and deploying our troops wisely so we don't overburden both our military and our economy. It means closing loopholes that have been abused by corporations, and it means saying no to corporate welfare that is shipping jobs overseas and hurting mainstream small businesses. Those are some of the things that we need to do to get our pocketbooks back in check, but we need to make sure that middle-class pocketbooks are protected and that the special interests, the insurance companies, the utility companies, and the folks who've been having their way in Washington, that they don't have the biggest seat at the table. Montanans and Americans want to see a government that works for them again.
Okay, Chris, your turn again.
Thank you. This question is about foreign policy and the foreign policy goals that the United States should have. In the recent past, we've seen our international standing decline sharply. And in fact, since 9/11, when most governments across the world and most people in most countries in the world were very supportive of the United States, we've gone to a situation from that high point to a situation where we now have difficulty even getting our closest allies to agree with us and to work with us on a range of issues. Our military is overstretched. The United States is not popular in many parts of the world, and it is making it or constraining our options for what we can do internationally. So my question is, what role does your candidate believe the United States should play in the world, and what policies would you have our government adopt in order to enable the U.S. to play that role? And specifically, what are the kinds of military, diplomatic, foreign aid, and military policies you think are going to be required to achieve your vision of what the proper role is for the United States?
Okay, Michelle, you start on this one.
Okay. Now, I am not an expert on foreign policy, and I cannot see Russia from my house. But I can give you some of the things that Barack and Joe have said on foreign policy. And I believe that Joe in particular has a lot of foreign policy experience. One of the things that they said, and you can check this out on Blueprint for America at barackobama.com, that Barack and Joe would launch an aggressive diplomatic effort to reach a comprehensive outreach to the rest of the world and to look at improving the stability in Iraq and the region. And they will do a big increase in American diplomacy to increase our standing again in the world. For the war in Iraq, Obama opposed the war in Iraq from the beginning. John McCain did not, and John McCain was wrong on the war in Iraq. Barack Obama would finish the fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And he's been calling for more troops and more resources in Afghanistan for years, where John McCain said, let's just muddle through. On nuclear weapons, Obama and Biden have a bold agenda to reduce the threat of nuclear proliferation. On Iran, Obama and Biden would use aggressive and direct diplomacy to prevent the Iranian regime from a nuclear program. And on having a 21st century military, Obama and Biden will give the finest military in the world the support it needs to deal with the threats of the 21st century. They would also invest in our veterans, and that means taking care of them when they come home. That means dealing with post-traumatic stress. My mom is a licensed clinical social worker, and a big chunk of her caseload includes returning veterans. And we need to take care of our veterans from beginning to end. Joe Biden fought for the veterans, for our troops to have the equipment they needed in Iraq so that they can do the job that they need to do. We need to have a responsible and phased withdrawal from Iraq. We need to increase diplomacy, and we need to prevent humanitarian crises. That would be a big step in the right direction, but we do have a big mess to clean up after the last 8 years from the Bush administration.
Okay, Mike?
Well, we've had plenty of troubles over the years with foreign policy, as we've seen with President George Bush. His idea of nation building, certainly Bob Barr would not be one president that would nation build. We've seen us support terrorists or freedom fighters over the years, and that's it's a definition that's pretty hard to imagine sometimes when we're supporting the Contras in Nicaragua, or we're supporting Saddam Hussein during the Israeli, or should say the Iran war. We gave money to Osama bin Laden during that time frame. So we tend to support the wrong people sometimes, and if we're in a different country and we support the wrong dictator, that really doesn't do us very good. I think Bob Barr would have us get out of Iran and Afghanistan. I noticed that Obama wants to keep us in Afghanistan for a while. He wants to send more troops into Afghanistan. We all know that Afghanistan has its trouble over the years. Even though the Soviets stayed in there 10 years, they couldn't hold it for 10 years. They had to finally get out because you've got so many different ethnic factions in Afghanistan that it's going to be difficult to control that. And the same is going to be true with Iraq. We've got everybody fighting each other in terms of religious ethnicities, and we're going to have to stay there just to keep things evened out. If that's the case, I don't think we should stay there. But obviously, when you listen to McCain, and he made the comment about being there for 100 years, that's simply a problem. Things like NATO, I think Bob Barr would say we need to get out of NATO. They've been a failure in terms of stopping some of these wars. They haven't been that effective at some of their issues, and we've been giving them quite a bit of money over the years. It's really been ineffective. And we're in NATO. NATO hasn't done us any well, or hasn't been as effective as it should, I think, over the years, being that the Cold War has now disappeared. We should let Japan and Germany and Europe pay for their own defense. I mean, the Department of Defense likes to say that we're in this many countries around the world, and I think sometimes we just need to get out of some of those countries and get home. We need to use our military to protect the United States interests, but also protect our borders here, and not become nation builders around this country, around the world.
Okay. Yes, follow-up question.
This is a follow-up for both of the representatives. Mike, you mentioned that Bob Barr does not support any nation building and that he would get out of Iraq and Afghanistan as soon as possible. How would that then add to the security of the United States if, in fact, al-Qaeda and in Afghanistan the Taliban are major sources not just of conflict within those countries, but also potential, especially in the case of al-Qaeda, potentially trying very hard to attack the United States? And then for Michelle, can you say something more about the overall role that Senator Obama wants the United States to play in the world? A lot of what you mentioned sounds like a quite ambitious program. Does he really envision trying to have the United States be the sole superpower, or does he believe that the United States should be first among equals?
Okay, let's let Mike start.
Well, thanks for the follow-up. It's going to know exactly what Barr would say on some of those things, but I think when you look at our foreign policy, when the first Bush invaded Iraq, we made some promises to the Kurds that we would send them some weapons, we'd send them some supplies and stuff like that. Well, we kind of bailed out on that promise. Those are the kinds of things that hurt us as a nation, foreign policy-wise. I mean, when we've got into the wars between Iraq and Iran, that was another foreign policy blunder, I think, because we supported both sides in the hope that they'd kind of obliterate themselves. And we could just go in, and I do think some of that stuff was for the oil concerns, because everybody has mentioned the fact that this war in Iraq has been a war for oil, and which it has been. Iraq has got plenty of oil reserves. They've got plenty of money, actually. They could be paying us back. And certainly the leaders of Iraq have expressed interest that it's going to be time for us to get out of there anyway. And they feel that their military is becoming a lot better in terms of protecting their country. The local police force is becoming a lot better. I think had we stayed out of there in the first place, we might not see things like Al-Qaeda. We might not see other terrorist organizations like the Taliban. When we've had trouble, say in Africa, we've had embassies that have been bombed. And that's basically because of our interest in some of those countries where we've backed the wrong candidate, I think, for some of those offices. And so that's going to be a problem with our foreign policy, and the fact that we've done more harm than good, I think, in some of those cases where we've sort of backed the wrong side. And I think we're going to have to get out of some of these entanglements, much like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson said in the early days of our nation, that we have to get out of some of these entangling type of situations that we're in.
Regarding the answer to your question, when I consulted with the Obama campaign and asked them what questions were likely to be a part of tonight, they said foreign policy wasn't really going to be the focus. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that question. But folks can go to the Obama campaign and check out barackobama.com.
Okay, back to
One issue that's tough for economists is health care. And health care is a tricky subject because we have evidence that free markets fail to provide adequate health care, and we have evidence that government-funded health care can fail. So given the problems with health care, and these are problems due to information where all the players have different bits of information, and so markets don't tend to work real well. We have problems of monopoly, and in order to invent a new drug, it takes a significant investment, and companies aren't going to be willing to make that investment unless they're going to get some return on it. And in addition, we have other problems dealing with our behavior, and people get to make choices there that spill over to others. For example, that's why we don't allow smoking in the library. These questions are difficult to deal with. The government can't mandate answers, and free markets don't seem to work real well. So my question is real simple. How should we structure our healthcare system?
okay, Michelle.
Did I start last time?
Well, we've been dealing with the healthcare issue for quite a long time. I mean, in the 50s, healthcare was pretty reasonable. You know, parents could go down, they could get health insurance, they could cover their kids. Doctors would actually go to people's homes and check up on people. It was a nice setup. Prices were pretty inexpensive in those days. But when we started getting into healthcare, with the addition of Medicare in 1965, well, healthcare certainly it rose some 15% that year. And so we know that that might be part of the problem. When Ross Perot in 1992 said, well, government just didn't look under the hood in 65 to see if this was going to be a good thing for this country. Back in 65, they said, oh, healthcare, it'll never get above 15 billion by the year 2000. It'll stay within that. But by 2000, it had already gone up to 100 billion. And with the Medicare Part D, I believe, healthcare costs is risen to some 500, 600 billion plus dollars in this country. And that is a problem. There is a problem, like you say, with behavior, because in some cases we're subsidizing bad behavior. We say, look, we got the safety net. If you get in trouble, well, we can go ahead and we'll pay for your treatment, and we'll pay for whatever ails you because you made some bad choices. I think that's certainly the wrong way to go. Barr has talked about access to affordability health care. But he's talked about getting back to some of the free market type ideas, because really what we've seen over the past few years with some of the regulations that have come forth, HMOs were mandated by government to decrease the cost of healthcare. Well, that didn't happen. Healthcare is still pretty costly, even with HMOs, and you can't choose your own doctor. There's some inherent things with the government mandating this type of legislation. Up north, Canada has a single payer system. I don't think anybody really wants to go up there and have your health care to be not really accessed, but determined whether or not your priority is ahead of somebody else's priority. If I've got cancer and I'm an old person, I might just die waiting for a health care cure because there's other people on the list that have a better chance of getting the health care than me. And so my only options are to go to the United States and to get health care coverage. So what Bob Barr he says our health care policy should be reformed based on the principle of consumer-oriented health care, and regulations that mandate health care coverage and inflate premiums should be eliminated. And we've seen that both on a national level. We've seen that on a statewide level as well, when the legislature mandates certain coverages for all insurance policies. Well, my insurance rates go up, and the hospital and healthcare rates go up as well. And so sometimes we need more cafeteria type plans to deal with some of these issues. And he talks about those controls which unduly restrict competition within the healthcare industry, and also that limit access to insurance across state lines, because many people have said that I should be able to get a policy in Minnesota, or I should be able to get a policy in North Dakota if it's a cheaper policy. Under those certain conditions, we do have the business equipment tax in some cases that increases the cost of certain equipment that would ultimately increases the cost of procedures that one has. And you're right that healthcare is complex. We do have different organizations out there. One is called Simple Care, that is simply getting rid of third-party payers, because they're one of the problems in this country that have pushed prices up. You've got the insurance companies, you've got the government that's pushing prices up. And so what these people have done, and we've got 2 or 3 companies in Missoula that have opened up shop. And you basically go down, they don't do insurance, they don't do Medicare or Medicaid. For a very low fee, you get to see the doctor for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, rather than spending that 30 minutes seeing a receptionist filling out an insurance form, then maybe getting 5 minutes to see the doctor about your problems. And this is a new innovative approach. They're trying to get back to the early days, and I think we've got to get back to more of those free market approaches, because I know Bob Barr was not support single payer system, nor would he support the single payer offshoots that we have in places like Canada and Europe, where basically you get in there and then they have to determine if your condition merits health care either immediately or health care 3 or 4 months down the road. And so things are going to have to change, because as I've mentioned before, costs keep rising, and we're spending $500 billion plus for healthcare costs, and things are going to have to change, and it's going to have to come within legislation, and hopefully it'll go the right way and not the wrong way.
Thank you, Mike. I would say we would all agree that healthcare is a big problem. It's one of the things that comes up the most as I go door to door talking to neighbors and to voters about their top concerns. There are 45 million Americans who do not have health insurance. Healthcare costs are skyrocketing. Health insurance premiums have doubled over the past 8 years. Too little is spent on prevention and on public health. The nation faces epidemics with obesity and chronic illnesses, yet despite this, less than 4 cents of every healthcare dollar is spent on prevention and public health. The John McCain plan is you're on your own, and good luck. He'd like to tell families that he'd give them a tax credit for healthcare, but he does not tell them that he'd pay for it with a massive tax increase on millions of middle-class families. And with healthcare costs skyrocketing, he'll tax your healthcare benefits for the first time in history. This is an old Washington bait and switch. McCain will give you a tax credit with one hand, but raise your taxes with the other hand to pay for it. and tens of millions of families will eventually come out behind. Your premiums will go up, and his tax credit just won't cover it. And of course, the John McCain approach to problems is to deregulate the healthcare industry. Just like he and his insurance company allies have done with our financial markets, that would be catastrophic for your healthcare. We know deregulation here in Montana has been a very bad idea. We cannot afford for more years of deregulation or Americans being forced to fend for themselves. The Barack Obama plan is to provide affordable health care to every American who wants it. He will work with employers who are providing health care for their employees and lower premiums by up to $2,500 per family per year. He will reduce costs for businesses and their workers by picking up the tab for some of the most expensive illnesses and conditions, including pre-existing conditions. One of the #1 reasons people go bankrupt is due to medical conditions. I met a woman on the doors. Her husband died of cancer. His medical bills bankrupt them, and they lost their home. And that is wrong. And our system is broken. For those who don't have health care, Barack Obama would expand the public system. For those who want or like what they have, they can keep it. But the bottom line is his plan would provide affordable, comprehensive, and portable health coverage for all Americans. He would require that insurance company plans accept all applicants and do not charge different prices based on any pre-existing conditions. He has a very detailed healthcare plan. You can find out more at barackobama.com. But he is committed to helping folks deal with rising healthcare. In fact, that is one of the reasons why some of the Republicans I met are voting for Barack Obama.
Okay, thank you. And back.
Thank you. I have a question about civil liberties. In the aftermath of 9/11, the federal government has gained enormous new powers to engage in surveillance of both citizens and non-citizens, both here and abroad, including the Patriot Act and the revision of the FISA law requiring the federal government to get court approval before doing certain kinds of surveillance. Do you support the continuation of these new powers that the government has received, or do you support repealing or sharply limiting the reach of the Patriot Act and other policies of this nature? Also, do you support the FISA process requiring a court order for certain kinds of wiretaps that has been substantially watered down by the Congress, or do you support allowing the government to continue to conduct wiretaps without consulting with the courts?
Okay. Michelle, I think you start on this one.
Sure. First, I'd like to just speak to civil rights in general. Obama and Biden will staff the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department with lawyers to explore civil rights violations, employment discrimination, and hate crimes. They'll protect the right to vote. They will promote fairness in the criminal and juvenile justice system. Regarding the infringement of the Bush administration on civil liberties, Barack and Joe agree that is wrong. They would not promote torture as the Bush administration has done. I do not have the specifics on FISA at this time. And again, I would encourage people to check out Barack's website on those particular issues. But the safeguards of our freedoms and our liberties is very important. And the extension of civil rights for all is very important. There are many folks who are falling through the cracks when it comes to civil rights. For example, with pay equity, we do not have equal pay for equal work as women, and that is wrong. For our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, they are not given same rights as those heterosexual couples under the law, and they can be discriminated against for their orientation and their jobs, and that is also wrong. There are discrepancies in our education system in areas where we have a long way to go so that we can have equality and justice for all in America.
Well, thanks for the question. Yeah, Bob Barr, since his retirement from Congress, has been working with the ACLU on a lot of very civil liberty issues. He agrees with Ron Paul that if we're going to protect civil liberties, we also have to protect the Constitution. And that's the main point that Bob Barr has talked about. We need to protect our First Amendment rights, certainly, to voice our opinion. We need to protect our Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizures. That includes things like the Patriot Act. That includes things like FISA, where phone companies now are required to turn over their phone records to the government agency. Wiretaps, Bob Barr is against warrantless wiretaps. He thinks you should go down if you've got information on a particular person that may be a terrorist. You should go down to a judge and ask for a warrant. Get that taken care of. Because we've seen problems when you give the government too much power, as in the case of the IRS, where they can go through and look at people's returns, and when they're really not supposed to give out that kind of information. But when you've got some of these bills like the Patriot Act, when you got things like FISA, they tend to make the bill, when they write the bill, they make it broad enough so that it includes everything. So if I wanted to say my neighbor's a terrorist, well, I could do that, and he'd be in a world of trouble, even though he's innocent. But the government would come in and investigate him, but they wouldn't have any evidence that he is a terrorist, only the fact that I said he was. And I think that's the problem with some of our civil liberties in the first place. When 9/11 happened, the Patriot Act, it was as if the Patriot Act itself was already written. Congress got it late in the evening, or in the morning, I should say. They didn't even have a chance to read it. I don't think there was any congressional members that read it. Ron Paul said that he had his staff look at it. Briefly, they found a few things that were unconstitutional, so he one of the few people that voted no on it. And so I think Congress should read their bills to begin with, and they should be allowed to accomplish that, but I don't think it would probably do much good. So we do have to protect our civil liberties, and I think the one avenue that we can do that, and if you look at the Sixth Amendment, it talks about trial by jury. Well, juries traditionally have had the notion of voting their conscience and judging the law. And we've seen this time and time again when we had a prohibition. Juries refused to convict people that were running alcohol during the Civil War, during the slave problems. Northern juries refused to convict people working to get slaves out of the South. And so in terms of civil liberties, if juries knew their rights to judge the law and vote their conscience, we can certainly tell the government no on things like the Patriot Act, no on FISA, no on warrantless wiretapping, and those kinds of things, and certainly protect the Constitution to begin with, because that's all Bob Barr would like to see, and we have to get back to protecting the Constitution as it is now, and not what some judge in the Supreme Court or some district court judge thinks that it should be. Because I think when you're looking at McCain and Obama, they've got this notion that the Constitution is something that can be rewritten over time, and it's not. It's a static document right there, and that's the document we have.
Okay, my last question deals with income inequality. There's evidence that income inequality is increasing in the United States, and while economists are debating the extent and the impacts of this change, the public perception is clear that we have greater income inequality. So my question is pretty simple. Is this a problem that the federal government should be concerned with? If not, why not? And if so, what do you think can be done?
Okay, Mike, I think you start here.
So to clarify, in your question, would that be both men and women, right?
I'm thinking about the rich versus the poor primarily.
Well, I guess there could be some problems with this notion of income inequality. I think what we're seeing nowadays, we're losing the middle class, because now we're seeing people that are either rich, and that's kind of a subjective notion. I mean, who's rich? I mean, under certain proposals, $40,000 is rich. Under other proposals, it's $240,000. Poor, I've seen various standards. I mean, I'm a low-income worker myself, making around $20,000, so I certainly am not rich. I know what Bob Barr would like to see probably is if we reduce government, if we reduce taxes, that would certainly help in this notion of take-home pay. Because when a family is, I should say, when the government is taking some 40 to 50% taxes from your paycheck, and if you include all the incidental taxes that we see in our everyday life, that's a problem. I mean, if we had that 20% less to put in our pockets, we could certainly spend it on the new car we wanted. We could spend it on an automobile or healthcare. There's lots of things that we could put that money into rather than send it to the government. And so we want to be able to do that also. And there have been, so in a sense, I think the free market can work. And once as Bob Barr would probably say, if you put the government in there with some of these solutions, like they've tried in the past, we simply exacerbate the problem, certainly to make it worse. And so we certainly would have to change that. And I don't have any really specific programs that he would put forth in Congress, but I think the main thing right now is simply just to reduce the size of government. I think if we reduce the tax burden on families, we'd certainly have enough money to deal with some of these problems that certainly come up. And I think that's probably the best way to deal with it, rather than to do mandates, because as we've seen with insurance costs, we've mandated coverage. What has happened? The cost has gone up. We mandated ethanol and gasoline. What happened there? The cost has simply gone up. And we mandate things. Who's going to be the recipient of the mandated program, and who's going to get the money? And so things are going to have to change, obviously.
Thank you, Mike. Michelle Obama said this morning, it is time not just to talk about family values, but to once again to take steps that value American families. The problem, there are nearly 37 million poor Americans, and more each day. Most Americans living in poverty work, but are still not making ends meet. We see that even here in Montana, where folks are working 2 or 3 jobs, and it's still not enough to cover the cost of gas, of groceries, of healthcare, or a lot of folks go without. There are things that we can do. Also, the minimum wage is not enough. When a parent works full-time earning minimum wage and still cannot make it, something is very wrong. Barack Obama has lived the American dream. He was raised by a single mom and his grandparents. He was able to go to Harvard on his own merits, but the American dream is inaccessible for too many people. There are things that can be done and the government can do. It can help more Americans climb the job ladder. Obama and Biden will help low-income Americans enter the workforce and move up the ladder. They can expand the earned income tax credit. Obama and Biden will increase benefits and expand the number of individuals eligible for earned income tax credits. And that is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs in history. And Obama has worked in a bipartisan way to get this done. He was able to pass an earned income tax credit in Illinois, and it has been very successful. Obama also pledges to increase the minimum wage to $9.50 an hour by 2009. He would also establish promise neighborhoods to combat chronic urban poverty, especially in areas where poverty is concentrated. And he would support economic development in low-income communities. Obama and Biden would help local entrepreneurs revitalize inner cities. These things would help make the American dream accessible again to everyday Montanans and Americans.
Okay, and final quick question.
Thanks very much, and I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters and the Missoula Public Library for putting on this program, and my fellow panelists. This is a relatively quick question. The next president, whoever he will be, is going to definitely nominate at least one person to the United States Supreme Court, and very likely 2, 3, or possibly even 4. What is the judicial philosophy of your candidate, and what are the criteria that they would use in nominating justices to the Supreme Court and judges to the U.S. federal courts?
Michelle, can you take that one?
Yes, I can. I have a lot of confidence in Barack Obama and Joe Biden to nominate qualified people to the U.S. Supreme Court. In fact, Senator Biden has overseen many of the Senate hearings that deal with the nomination of Supreme Court justices. And Barack Obama was a constitutional law professor at the University of Chicago. They believe so much in protecting the Constitution. And that includes your Second Amendment rights as an individual right to bear arms. In regards to who they would select, Barack Obama and Joe Biden would select people who would be very judicious on the court, but not folks who would be like Scalia or Thomas or Roberts, not folks who would put their own agenda first, and not folks who would uphold inequity against folks like Lilly Ledbetter. Lilly Ledbetter sued Goodyear Tire for paying her less per hour for doing the same job as a man. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, said that that was okay because Lilly did not bring the suit soon enough. Barack Obama knows that pay inequity is wrong and would not support Supreme Court justices who would not uphold equal pay for equal work, but who would value the civil liberties and rights of all Americans.
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, Bob Barr, he was a lawyer. He served several terms in Congress. He has helped such organizations as the ACLU, the Marijuana Policy Project, in terms of civil liberties, in terms of civil liberties, the Patriot Act, FISA. In his recommendations for Supreme Court judges, he would want to see judges that actually interpret the Constitution not as a living document, but as it was written. So that when we've seen decisions like Keller, who he was wrote our brief for the Libertarian Party, the only political party actually to have a brief on the Second Amendment. I mean, sure, Barack Obama may say we should keep and bear arms, but he also thinks that the Second Amendment doesn't mean what the Second Amendment actually means. It means that people should have the right to bear arms, and it doesn't say they should have the right to bear arms except they can't buy guns at gun shows. They have to have a waiting period. They have certain other different things. So I think what we actually need is just Supreme Court nominees that will follow the Constitution, not try to interpret it.
Okay, I think that ends our evening. Thank you all for your participation. It's wound up being a very interesting evening, I think. And thanks to Anita and to the library for making this possible. We appreciate being here.
And thank you for having us.
critical cases. Now think of the flu. Whole families got it at once, right? Doesn't the whole family go down at once? Isn't that awful? You think, man, 1 week you could get a break, but no, mom goes down, everybody goes down at the same time. Well, that happened here too. And these two pictures are two homes side by side. One's got a historical marker. These were Northern Pacific rental homes. So they're over on the north side on, people that know me know that I lose my proper nouns. It's the first thing to go. It'll come to me and I'll let you know. But it's a street that runs north-south on the north side. It's not much of a through street. And in that family, on October 22nd, Mrs. Josephine Jones, age 19, died in one of these two houses. They either had the addresses wrong or they rented two houses side to side. I went through the city record, and previous years they had rented two other houses side to side. So hard to know. So the daughter, age 19, died on October 22nd. On October 23rd, her mother, Mrs. McClellan, age 57, died. On October 26th, her other daughter, the first girl's sister, age 26, Mrs. Vincent, died, age 24. On October 27th, their other sister, Mrs. Charles Kylo, died. So that's 4. They couldn't bury. The family could not get themselves buried. 4 died. Then when the brother came over from Spokane as a result of all this, he got the flu and died. So 5 members of this family died that I know of influenza, left 7 young children behind. And here's their gravestones, a picture from Kurt Wilson. St. Mary's Cemetery. Next page. Well then, everything got better. And we had November 11th, Armistice Day. And this is the Missoula, and the war ended. And the whole country was out parading and, of course, relieved. And if we go back to our epi curve, which we'll go back to in a minute, we were way on the downside for flu cases now, right? We are at the very bottom of that first big spike. So they really, really, really believed it was over. Thank God for that. And so there were a lot of victory parties and parades and so on and so forth. And the quote I lifted there from the paper is, the entire state seems to have more or less disregarded during the peace celebrations all the bans on congregation. Well, of course. It's all over. Can't be faulted for that. So these are the kind of ads, next page, we had in the newspapers. You know, get your clothes in now, get them to the cleaners, get them disinfected. Okay. Next one. But here's where we were on the epi profile. We're right here. It sure fell over. We made it. Then there would have, like I said, there would have been another spike. That's how these things proliferate.
The war had only continued.
Well, at this point, where we're at that nadir there, we had 92 deaths, 1,354 cases. Then things started to go up. Well, now what? Things aren't working. What do we do now? And you'll see the confusion that every community had about, now what do we do? Do we go back into quarantine? We're ready to open the school. You know, what do we do? We've had 3 months of this. And here is where communities really showed their nature. I love this. So there was a story in the paper about a county in Idaho. When the uptick started again, they decided they were going to do reverse quarantine. They just got militant, and they said, they put the men around the different roads, and they said, you're not coming into our county, by God. We are done with the flu, and you're not coming in. None of this quarantine keeps you, and you're not coming in here. And a district judge tried to go through that county and was denied access. So, so that was that community's nature, okay? So I was researching this, and of course you stumble on Butte. How could you not? So the next picture, Butte was very Butte-like. Butte almost had martial law. And the martial law, the issue was if the bars could remain open or not. And of course they'd been under martial law with labor unions, so it was no big deal. They're threatening martial law. And there's a quote, and I'm so sorry I did not write down exactly if this came out of the Butte Miner, but the editor says, it is not known if Butte is sick or well, open or closed, wet or dry. So I'm researching this, and my teenage daughter's across the table from me, and I get to this part of Missoula. Now, what do we do when they start going up? And I said, Emily, what do you think? We did it. And she goes, Well, we would have wanted to talk about it. I said, God, I can't believe you are so right. So turn the next page. Missoula had meetings. We had a medical board, and it had subcommittees, and they met throughout the weekend, December 7th, 8th, and 9th, while all this was going on, to decide what to do. But they came out with recommendations. So the next one is the recommendations. They decided to do what they always used to do when you had illness in a house, is you put a placard on the house that you couldn't quarantine the city. People had to get back to work. They had to get back to school. You could go to church if you sat in every other pew. No dancing. They recommended hiring a school nurse. The school did not hire a nurse, and the editor and the superintendent Fee had in this big shouting match in the newspaper. It's just lovely. The children had to have their temperatures tested twice a day and their throats sprayed with hyamil oil. And to improve the morale of the city, the newspaper would publish the names of those who've recovered, not just those who died. And now, could we please see about getting the use of the Fort Hospital, this hospital, because they didn't have it available to them. By the time they got permission, the entire epidemic was over.
And they did distancing, which is nice.
They did social distancing.
Yeah.
Nod, don't shake hands, I don't know. So this is what the editor had to say at the end of the second spike, New Year's Day. Next. It was a wonderful year, perhaps the most wonderful in all the world's history. Why? Because the war. That was the context. And what I've put down here is 173 recorded deaths by January 1st, 1919, 28 cases in Missoula. So the context is everything. So that's the end of my story. I did not go through all of the papers for the next 3 months, as you saw in the epidemic profile that peters out, but I will tell you that scarlet fever either never left or came back to the university. And by the middle of March, the cases of influenza and scarlet fever at the university were running neck and neck, and scarlet fever was beginning, like in a horse race, to overtake what the problems were. That's it. I can't thank you enough for coming. I love telling the story, so I'll tell it to anyone.
I was, the summer of about 1952 or 53, I was in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and they were having a polio epidemic, and they shut the churches, the theaters, swimming pools.
Swimming pools were the big fear.
Mm-hmm. Water was. Now, it'd be interesting, and maybe you have done that, it was never turned a pandemic, but I think these epidemics of polio popped up in different towns and cities around the country and world. Would that have been a pandemic, or was it because it just kind of...
No, those are...
hot spots.
By the strict definition, pandemic really refers to the fact that the virus is novel, that the system hasn't seen it before.
And the polio virus?
It's still referred to as an epidemic. I'm not sure I can parse that out. I don't know how to answer that.
But they did the same thing, isolation.
Yeah.
It was a really boring summer.
Yeah, the swimming
really.
the swimming pools were a mother's nightmare.
Oh, people were...
Yeah.
And actually, one of our future speakers for Uncover Missoula, whose teaches over in the University in the History Department, has published a book on the history of swimming pools, and I'm sure he will be taking up this very topic.
You had a question or comment in the back?
I think you had said that most strains of present-day flu come from this.
The H1N1, yeah.
So how prevalent or serious was the flu in human beings prior to 1918?
Well, again, we have recorded pandemics, like the 1892 one I featured in there. There were probably others that were earlier and may not be recorded because they weren't diagnosed as such. The earlier you get into the 1800s, the less likely you have a public health system in place to even record these things. Does that make sense? Let alone, diagnose them correctly. So I kind of...
Are there other strains of flu that exist today that aren't related to this?
Not circulating readily in an airborne way among humans. That's the fear of watching the H5N1 is, could it mutate in a way that it doesn't just infect humans who come maybe in direct contact with blood or something, but in an airborne, very readily spread manner.
So say in 1917, there was really no airborne flu going on.
You know, they haven't really, what I've read, examined any, what would be known as the 1917 variety. There is there's been so much work put into identifying the 1918 and recombining that virus, and they only succeeded in doing that 2 years ago, November. Now, and they did that in part through tissue samples and some frozen samples from permafrost. But the scientist, the main scientist doing that, Tannenberger, actually works for the U.S. Army. And he works, there's a whole bank of tissue samples that go years and years and years and years back. And so he figured, well, I got to do something. Why don't I do something that might be useful? And he spent, a decade or more trying to. Then he hooked up with another physician with CDC, and the two of them were able to recombine it, identify the markers, and say that indeed it was avian, and it has more avian markers than human markers.
What kinds of tissue samples? Would they regularly take tissue samples of it?
Yeah, they do. The pathology, there's in the Army has entire banks of pathology slides.
Wax. One thing I saw is they took the little slabs and
Oh, like
sealed
for
them in wax.
microtape.
They go way, way back before, again, they go back before we knew that there were viruses.
Do they do this now?
Well, and they dug up
Wow.
the grave.
And they dug up, right.
And they did do, that's permafrost, I wondered.
So a really good book on that was written just before this discovery was actually made, and it's about the seeking of this, and it's written by Gina Kolata. She's an excellent science writer, Kolata. It reads like a mystery. Well, now we know the answer, and she talks about.
Solving the mystery.
So that's why they're studying that virus. And it's real interesting when you look at the politics. Like I read about H5N1. I get online and I read about this. There's a lot of politics between nations on who's going to share their virus information on the H5N1 and who's not going to share it, and the ethical ramifications of it should be shared, but then you won't get the money to continue the research because you won't own it anymore, and on it goes. It's very, very, there's an awful lot of cultural aspects to the entire search.
What is our city or county of Missoula, what is the thinking now? You said you're trying to prepare for the next one whenever. What kind of things are you learning from this history?
The thing that I've really learned is the hill climb followed by a marathon. That, I don't have much experience with disasters, and my tenure in public health doesn't have that much experience with epidemics either. So I know that many of us don't have that these days. But I have experience in looking at epidemiological profiles, and when I saw that one, it just tells me, get ready to be able to collect information, share information, and jump to it really fast, and then be ready to persevere, because unlike a disaster such as an explosion, which is horrific, an explosion doesn't necessarily proliferate itself and continue for 6 months. And so we're trying to think, well, how would you then, let's say you get through that first spike, how are you going to sustain?
Well, I was thinking in concrete terms. Is there a plan? I mean, we have, 3 hospitals in Missoula, I guess, and how many beds would they take?
We're working on that right now. The hospitals are working with us.
Are you going to do isolation? Are you going to do masks?
Yes.
How are you going to handle the publicity and the directives to the public?
That's what we're digging into. Those are excellent questions. We don't have the answers, but we're.
Have the field house and have enough cots to do it.
We have visited the field house. We have toured it.
Good.
Yeah. One of the lessons though is that most of the people, as bad as this was, most people didn't get ill. Okay, so there's your. That's your resource. That is your resource.
For the
People who
DNA.
don't get
Yes.
sick.
And then most of the people aren't necessarily going to need a hospital. But that said, there won't be enough hospital beds to even get something much more minor than this. So we're working, and the hospital is extremely cooperative with their time and their expertise, and we meet every month, and we have committees. Well, of course, Missoula, we have lots of committees, numerous committees.
So this is a very
Drills.
now topic.
But what we're really trying to get out of it isn't necessarily preparing for the pandemic that may never look like this again, is we're trying to get stronger for the everyday and the smaller things that we could work together better on, that do happen. And so we're getting those benefits. Whether a pandemic does or doesn't happen on this scale is...
Even an epidemic still...
And building those relationships is really important, so that when you sit down at the table, you know who each other are. And that's a big piece of it. Right, breaking down those territorial.
Well, and you know, there's no territorialism in when we sit down at this table.
Well, modern flight now, you can have someone, and there's been cases where they've incubated something they picked up in Africa and landed in New York, or conceivably Missoula during an incubation where all of a sudden, in 12 hours, you brought something from Johannesburg, South Africa, to Missoula.
Yeah, and then you've got to recognize it. That's the main thing, is recognizing it.
Trace it.
Right.
That
Right.
means people should be searched in a bacteriological sense.
I'm not going there. And I'm not burning down Grinnell Park either.
We did do that for SARS, when SARS.
Yeah, we were
was
ready for
screening
that.
At airports, and I actually, when I was in Alaska, and we had screenings
How
at the
did you
airports.
screen for that?
Those planes that came from China, we had the CDC, Arctic CDC out there.
But I mean, what do you...
Temperature?
Yep, temperature.
Body temperature.
Yeah.
In a body
Symptoms and
search?
symptoms. Of individuals, we did symptom screens and temperatures. Yeah.
Well, that young
They had
fellow
symptoms
with
and
the TB that they thought he was spreading, he didn't say that he was sick and the flu.
Right, yeah, that was a
big-
that was a perfect
Mm-hmm.
example.
Snuck into the country.
Yeah, and well, and it was an example of how easy, like what we were talking about coming from another country, the ease of transportation now is just puts a whole new factor on it.
Our daughter was returning from Turkey, and she was doing research over there, and she had a really bad cold, and they sent her to an airport doctor to check her over before she could board, which I thought was a good idea.
Yeah, I don't. Well, anyhow, that, you know, the end of the story is the community, you know, recovered from it. Not everyone recovered, and so when we look at that we tend to focus on the blue part of the chart, but the whole rest of that epi profile is not blue. So that's the resource, and we have to be prepared to. So, and we believe people will want to help, but they'll want to know how, and that's what we're going to try to be prepared for. Mary.
Ellen, why did they ever make any connection with Kansas? Why they thought it started there?
Yes. They're actually, I haven't read this in a while, so.
Coming back from...
There was actually, what's really interesting is there's some epi links, but not necessarily viral, you know, confirmed viral links now looking back, to a spring, a flu that arose in the spring of 1918. And it kind of subsided, and then it came back and exploded. And it could have been the conditions that caused it to explode. I don't know.
The other thing that you brought up is the need to be on top of the data, and the fact that there were a couple of doctors who were working with the military, one the doctor that started Johns Hopkins, who were ready, they actually were ready for this, and they started capturing the data right away.
Yeah, numbers. And then keep in mind, that, you know, the swine flu, we were so ready for swine flu. And it turned out to be, some people think it was a debacle, but the conditions, the novel virus, the outbreak, it all started, they got the vaccine going, and it didn't continue.
And it stopped. Yeah.
And what?
So that's the pandemic that didn't happen. You know, you can't know.
And how do the experts think? Why is the reason it stopped?
For some, if there's a saving grace in something that spreads this easily, it's usually that the only way it can spread that easily is not to kill most of its victims. Okay? So, in that tipping point between, I'm oversimplifying, this is not how a doctor would say it, but in that tipping point, right now, the bird flu that has gotten into humans, the H for the new one, has had a fatality rate that started out at 70%, is now down to about 50%. It's humongous. It's huge. But for that very reason, it can't spread readily from person to person. It's killing its host. And so as it mutates and it gets to where, it can move through people and not kill the majority of people, then it has the ability to spread.
It could, in like that initial outbreak, kill its host, and that's just the way it goes.
It could. Yeah.
Yeah, it just depends.
Yeah. I mean,
Virulence, what the virulence is.
Interesting.
we still don't know why the 20 to 40-year-olds why that W was there. Very good and well-founded science, but it still is unproven.
Well, you said it wasn't necessarily pneumonia, but something else that was.
Yeah. Their lungs, it wasn't a bacterial pneumonia necessarily. It happened so quickly and you'll see these accounts, particularly in the Army accounts, when you read Crosby's or even John Barry's newer book. It basically suffocated in their own fluids. Yeah, like a pulmonary edema or hemorrhagic. So, cytokines or, a really overdone immune response, over the top. I mean, they don't know, but they've not had a influenza of all these where that W has occurred. There's a lady behind you. Excuse me.
In 1957, when that Hong Kong, as they called it, flu came, I got that quite badly. And I have never had a flu since then, nor have my children. Is there some kind of immunity?
Well, you have some protection now because you're a survivor of that virus, and then viruses, even though they've mutated, that are similar to that. I mean, one of the things that's kind of morbid that we talk about is once you get immune survivors, then now you're cooking, because now you can put people to work on the epidemic that have survived it and are immune. Does that make sense?
But is that a common thing?
I don't know. I can't speak about your children. I would be totally off track to try to do that. But it is expected that you would have some level of immunity to a virus real similar to that one. Because your system just recognizes it now. It's survived it. You've got.
Well, we don't want to keep you here all night, but to let you know that not the next one of these, but the one following it, we're going to have another discussion on this fascinating topic that we're all seem to be obsessed with. Morbid as it may be.
It is obsessive.
On July 10th. The man who was our museum researcher and putting together our exhibit, Alan Johnson, is going to be talking about his research on that. And if you haven't had a chance to go in and see the exhibit, either now or some other time, you should do it because it's pretty fascinating. So we'll be taking up another part of this particular historical look at the 1918 flu on July 10th. So we'd love to see you back for that. And for those of you who are interested in the polio epidemic, that would be a very good question for Dr. Wiltsey on the August 26th program, because I'm sure he will talk.
And I can't thank the museum and you and MCAT enough. Thank you a lot.
Glad you were here. Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the worst examples, though, in North America is the smallpox decimating the Native Americans.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 90%.
50-60%.
Right. So it's called a virgin population.
So it wasn't totalitarian, it wasn't terrorizing or terroristic in the way that this totalitarian model holds it to be. But there was an exception. You couldn't stand up and say, down with the regime. There were limits to what you could do. It wasn't a pluralist democracy. It wasn't, they didn't respect freedom of speech or the celebration of dissent. You couldn't stand up and say, what you're doing to the Jews is a crime. There were limits. And that's what Sophie Scholl and the others ran up against. And so I don't mean to suggest that this was like Hyde Park in London, or that people had First Amendment protections, as they generally do in this country. It wasn't like that. But for individual and collective disobedience and even resistance, if done in the proper manner, there was an awful lot of room for that. And so that's, I think, a much more accurate account of Nazi Germany than the conventional one that's been handed down to us. Yes?
My question is one of naive dictatorship.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Naive dictatorship, by which I mean the people in the countryside could have been asking or saying, if Hitler knew, this wouldn't be happening. And the two examples I have to support that come from The Twisted Road to Auschwitz by Karl Schlinnis. He says that the regime, not Hitler specifically, passed just between the years of 1933 and 39 over 400 anti-Semitic laws. And that the definition of a Jew took a really long time to create because Hitler kept asking for drafts and drafts and drafts of what the definition of a Jew should be. And then when called upon to announce that to the public, he didn't decide until right before he announced it. So it seems that Hitler is sort of a secretive, almost micromanager, in that he really doesn't let anybody know what he's deciding on until the last minute, so that he can sort of say, oh, I didn't know it was going to go that way. So can you really say that there wasn't in the country that sort of, oh, well, we didn't know that Hitler had decided upon this, that's why we still support the Nazis, or we didn't know, or he didn't know that, or Hitler didn't know that this was going to go awry, so it's not really his fault?
Hitler was a greatly admired figure in Germany. I think it's pretty fair to say that he was the most popular politician in German history, at least from, let's say, 1939 to 1942. And it was one of the common tropes in Germany to say the bad party officials are doing this, Hitler doesn't know about it. People often said this when they didn't like what was going on and didn't want to think that their deeply admired leader, Hitler, believed these, was responsible for these things. If one speaks about the Jews, however, there was no one in Germany who could be mistaken about where Hitler stood on this. After all, he fulminated quite publicly and repeatedly in the most vociferous terms about the evils of Jews and Jewry, and about the need to eradicate Germany of their influence, if not the people themselves. And so this was, to say the least, not a secret, and not even an open secret, but something that was manifest and unmistakable. Just to give you a sense of how different the times were. If you've ever seen a speech by Hitler, if you never have, you should, or if you have, you should think about it. Think of this guy who looks like a raving madman, up there shouting, frothing at the mouth. I mean, he makes, the most impassioned, screaming American politician look tame. Frothing at the mouth, screaming, shaking his fist, and the stuff he says, or read Mein Kampf, is just completely bonkers by any sane person's standards today. Talking about how there are subhuman races or races of lesser values and all this stuff about Jews and so on. And he even said, I forget the year, 1929 or 1931, that perhaps all German children born with physical defects should be killed. Now, imagine if a politician in this country, imagine if a politician in Germany today would act the way he does, say the things he did, make a statement about killing German children born with physical defects. And so imagine he would be seen as being an utter lunatic, not fit to be part of the ordinary political spectrum, and would seem to be mad and potentially dangerous, assuming anybody would pay attention to him, or assuming that anybody but those in the lunatic fringe would pay attention to him. But this person who was doing this, and he was saying other things about how Germany needed to be strong, and things that made a lot more sense to Germans, of course. But this person won millions and millions and millions of votes in Germany, and eventually became the Chancellor of Germany and the most popular politician in German history. Again, what does this tell you about the overall mindset and mental moral universe of Germans of the time? So on Jews and the peoples of the East and the need for Germany to conquer the East and all this, everybody knew that Hitler was behind this. They didn't know where he stood on particular policies. And the whole issue then of Hitler's position or decision-making style and his role in different decisions is a very complicated one, and we have to go issue area by issue area, decision by decision. But that too is a long discussion for another day, and so I'll end here, and thank you for your patience.
Is what I've been alluding to, is if Tuesday sends a signal on Iraq, and by the way, one of two signals: stay the course, maybe up the ante, embolden those who I mean, it's to the extent to which this is a referendum, one has to recognize that the referendum can go both ways, and of course it could be somewhere in the middle. But to the extent to which this is a call for a change in Iraq, the question will be whether that has a ripple effect beyond Iraq's borders, perhaps as a consequence of the fact that part of the change in Iraq is a change on Syria. And it might be that part of a change on Iraq is if, as some people have said, and I think Senator Biden has been terribly thoughtful on this, and he... him and Les Gelb have come up with their position on what the alternative for Iraq should be. What I like about that is because he quotes me from when we put out the Geneva Initiative, which was this detailed model plan. I'm sure he doesn't actually quote me. When we put out this detailed modeled Israeli-Palestinian peace plan, and our response to people who didn't like it was, what's your plan? Have you got something better? And that's why I think he's been bold. He's put out a plan, and with real legitimacy, he says, what are you going to do? Now, part of his plan, and it might be something that is echoed in policy that's pursued and in the Baker-Hamilton study group, is you're going to have to get the neighborhood much more involved. And I think that if you begin to get into that conversation with the neighborhood, and the neighborhood includes the Jordanians and the Saudis, right, as well as the Syrians, then I do think you begin to open up some avenues to explore on the Israeli-Palestinian stuff. I think it's not coincidental that there was a secret meeting, apparently not that secret anymore, between Israeli Prime Minister Olmert and a senior member of the Saudi leadership. It's not coincidental that people are talking about the Saudi initiative again. I think it's not inconceivable that this could help generate momentum towards something new on the Israeli-Palestinian track. My hope, and I've got an article to this effect in arguing this in this month's Washington Monthly, which I imagine can be got online. I would say the one thing Congress could do would be to say, okay, Baker Hamilton, assuming they do a good job on Iraq, and we still don't know that would be the case, you're not dismissed yet. Now tell us how to put the broader Humpty Dumpty of the Middle East back together again and stay on for an extra 6 months. So that's just a kind of policy, political thing I would advocate. But I mean, so it could have. That's the place where it could have. And I'm glad to know there's a Hillel here.
Thank you very much.
Daniel, I think we're coming to the end of the hour, and we have a saying in Montana, and I'll share it with you. That is, you know, when we find a good horse, we ride it very hard. You've had a full day, and I think you have some more events. Bob is relentless here in scheduling things, but truly we want to thank you for coming out here and sharing with us an insight that we would never have had. I think you give us probably at this time maybe the most precious of all commodities, and that is hope, a belief that something can be done. It's not going to be easy, but with people like you, it's always possible, and we all think, I speak for all of us, I think, when I say that we have a much better sense and a much better clarity of what the realities are, be they as difficult as they are, but also the positive things. Because you said it yourself, people basically in a village in Gaza or in Israel want the same things. They want dignity, they want freedom, they want opportunity. So again, thank you very much for coming our way. I think Daniel will be here for a moment or two if you have another question you want to come up.
And also, I would like to say that Daniel will be present on this campus tomorrow morning in this building in room 327, first period, that is, from 8:10 until people leave. Well, we do have catch plane, but he wants to be, this is an invitation to students to come and talk with him, to university students tomorrow morning.
All right, now we'd really better let him go because he's got an early start tomorrow. Thank you very much.